On a Friday morning in July of 1988, the corn south of McPherson County curled before noon, and the road ditches had already gone gray. The fields that had looked perfect in May now stood under a white sky with leaves rolled tight as pencils, each acre giving up a little more of itself by the hour. Pickup trucks were parked along fence lines. Men stood with their hands on their hips and stared without saying much. By 10 o'clock, everyone knew the same thing. The heat had stopped being weather. It had become a reckoning. In the spring of that year, the modern answer had looked clean, efficient, and expensive enough to feel safe. The standard system was a 4-pass tillage and planting program built around a new 6-row planter, a field cultivator, a chisel plow, and a full chemical package. The planter alone had cost $18,400. The field cultivator had cost another $9,600. The chisel plow added $7,250. By the time fertilizer, fuel, herbicide, and payments were counted, some men were carrying more than $41,000 into a single crop season before the corn was knee-high. It had straight rows. It had heavy down-pressure springs. It had fertilizer openers mounted ahead of the row units. It had monitor lights in the tractor cab to tell a man he was farming correctly. It had every visible sign of progress. And it failed for reasons most of those men did not understand. On the first day of the heat wave, the bare fields baked from the top down. The spring tillage had left them smooth and beautiful, but it had also left the surface exposed. By afternoon, the topsoil was hot enough to sting a hand. The last useful moisture near the surface began to disappear into the air. On the second day, men tried to save what they could with cultivation timing, side dress adjustments, and hopeful talk about a rain front forming somewhere west of Salina. But the cultivated ground shed the little overnight dew it held. The roots had to go looking deeper, and in too many fields they found dry soil faster than anyone expected. On the third day, the county coffee shop was full before sunrise. Men talked about crop insurance, emergency haying, and whether the forecast had been wrong or whether the year itself had turned against them. By then, the leaves were rolled by mid-morning, pollination was under pressure, and the cost of every lost bushel was being counted before the kernels had even formed. At $2.30 corn, a 320-acre farm losing even 25 bushels an acre was staring at $18,400 gone. Lose 40 bushels, and the damage pushed past $29,000. That was enough to swallow machinery payments, land rent, and a year's worth of optimism in one dry month. By the end of that week, even the men with the crisp shirts and county maps had stopped speaking in full sentences. "There just isn't much left to manage," one crop advisor said quietly. "Not if the profile's gone." There were no solutions on the table. That's when an old Ford pickup rolled in. It was a faded 1,000. 974 3/4 ton, with a dent in the passenger side fender and a seed company sticker in the back glass that had turned almost white in the sun. It moved slower than the other trucks on the road, not because it had to, but because the man driving it had never felt the need to arrive in a hurry. Let me tell you about Harold Bender, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Harold was 68 years old and had farmed 320 acres in McPherson County, Kansas, for 39 years. He had taken over the place after coming home from the Army and burying his father 2 winters later. He had raised corn, milo, and wheat on ground that wasn't big enough to make anyone rich, and wasn't poor enough to make a man quit if he knew what he was doing. Harold was not a man who sat around the co-op on Saturdays explaining himself. He was a quiet man, a watcher. The kind of farmer who noticed what the wind did to snow in January and what that meant for moisture in June. He paid cash for everything he owned. He owed nothing on his ground. He repaired his own machinery. He did not attend many meetings because meetings, in Harold's opinion, had never once sharpened a planter disc or brought rain. When he got out of the truck that morning, he did not look at the men lined up by the road. He did not ask how bad it was. He did not offer sympathy. He stepped over the barbed wire crossing, walked into his field, bent down, and pulled back a handful of old corn stalks. Then he put his hand into the soil beneath them. Harold's father, Elias Bender, had started keeping more residue on the ground in 1956, after a hot summer, taught him something he never forgot. He had not called it no-till. Men like Elias rarely named things before universities did. He just said a field ought not lie naked in Kansas wind if you could help it. He had bought a John Deere 494 a planter in 1957 for $1,180 in cash, a serious sum for a family that still counted every repair bolt in a coffee can by the stove. That was the same year the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, and a lot of Americans started thinking the future belonged to machines, with lights on them. Elias Bender did not care about lights. He cared whether a ROUGHT unit would hold depth in hard ground, and whether a machine could be fixed with tools already hanging in the barn. He told Harold once, "Pretty ground don't feed you. Living ground does." Let me tell you about that planter and the method around it, because they're the real heart of this story. The 494A was not impressive by the standards of the 1980s. It was a 4-row planter built long before farming became a showroom competition. It was heavy where it mattered, simple where it ought to be, and understandable from one end to the other. Its frame was steel. Its seed boxes were plain. Its parts could be held in your hand and explained without a dealer's manual. It was built in 1957. The same year, men were looking up at Sputnik and wondering if the whole world had become too modern to touch. Modern planters in 1988 moved faster, covered more acres, and looked better doing it. But they also assumed something Harold did not. They assumed the field had already been cleaned, polished, loosened, and prepared for them. Harold's planter did not assume cooperation. It was adapted over time to work through a rougher surface. Coulters were changed. Row cleaners were improvised. Weight was balanced by trial and memory more than by handbook recommendation. When aggressive tillage became common and black fields became a point of pride in the 1960s and 1970s, most men around Harold either burned residue, disked it under, or worked it smooth until a field looked like a garden bed. That was the look banks liked. That was the look county men liked. That was the look neighbors liked because it photographed well from the road. Harold's father never trusted it. After Elias died, Harold kept the same habit. Not perfectly, not all at once, but steadily. He left more stalk cover. He disturbed less soil where he could. He paid attention to which fields held moisture longer, which rows stayed cooler in July, which low spots crusted over, and which ones remained open underneath the residue. Most farmers thought he had simply fallen behind the times. Some of them believed that honestly. Others believed it because Harold's place did not look as polished as theirs in April. His fields had stalks on them. Last year's corn still showed itself in places. In a county where appearance passed for evidence, that was enough to convict a man. Harold had not stumbled into the method by accident. He had spent years refining it. In 1979, after a dry spell scorched one of his cleaner-worked fields faster than another field that had more cover on it, he went deeper into the system. He found an old soil conservation bulletin. He talked to a retired SCS man in Hutchinson who explained residue cover in plain language. He rebuilt closing wheels in his own shop. He welded brackets by lantern light in March. He checked seed depth with a pocket knife and a ruler. He made changes, one season at a time. By 1985, he had the system working the way he wanted. Not fast, not pretty, but working. And every spring after that, Harold ran those rows the same way a good mechanic starts an old engine once a month. To keep the knowledge alive, to keep the equipment honest, to keep himself sharp. He had always known the ground under residue stayed different, cooler, softer, less eager to surrender. He had just never had a year cruel enough to prove it in public. The loudest mockery came, as those things often did, at the co-op. It happened in April, before planting was finished, when men were still cheerful enough to laugh at one another, and still arrogant enough to believe spring appearances meant autumn truth. A crowd had gathered around the bulletin board near the front counter, talking seed populations, herbicide rates, and rain that had not yet failed them. Rick Mullen was the most vocal critic. Rick was 42, college-trained, articulate, and employed by a local ag retailer that sold seed, chemicals, and certainty in equal measure. He wore clean caps, clean boots, and the expression of a man who expected to be listened to. He had the kind of confidence that came from charts, debt, and a good run of favorable years. "Harold's not planting corn," Rick said loudly enough for the feed line and the office counter to hear. "He's planting through trash." There was a pause. Then he added, "Somebody ought to tell him last year's stalks aren't a crop." The crowd laughed. One of the younger farmers leaned against the cooler and said, "Maybe he's growing firewood." That got another laugh. And just like that, the name stuck. Within 2 weeks, half the county had heard about Harold's trash field. Within a month, it had become a running joke at the co-op, at the church potluck, and at the parts counter in town. People said it casually at first, then proudly. The way people enjoy repeating a line they think proves they belong with the winning side. "Seen Harold's trash field lately? Wonder if he's farming corn or raccoons. Maybe next year he'll leave the whole combine out there too." Harold heard some of it. Not all of it. Enough. He didn't respond. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain the system, or mention evaporation, or residue cover, or root zone temperature, or any of the things he had spent years learning while other men were laughing at surfaces. He just paid for his grease, folded the receipt once, put it in his shirt pocket, and walked out. The screen door slapped shut behind him, and the laughter kept going for another 10 seconds after he was gone. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever known something in your bones that you could not easily explain to people who had already decided you were wrong? Have you ever kept doing something that looked foolish from the outside because you understood something deeper than appearances? Have you ever sat through the small public cruelty of other people's laughter and said nothing because the only answer worth giving had not happened yet? A lot of people have. Not on a farm. Not in Kansas. Not in a drought year. But in their own way. Harold had that kind of certainty as he planted those rows and listened to the stalks whisper under the gauge wheels. He had it when men drove by slowly and looked over. He had it when the jokes spread. He had it when rain stopped coming and the county began to worry. He didn't need the laughter to stop. He needed the ground to hold. The argument finally came in late June near the edge of Harold's South Quarter, when Rick Mullen pulled his truck up to the road and stepped out with a folded field map in one hand. Rick looked across the rows and shook his head. "You're keeping too much trash on top," he said. "Ground like that stays cold in spring and wastes moisture you could have used." Harold did not look up immediately. He snapped a bit of dry stalk in his fingers, let it fall, and then answered. "It saves moisture," he said calmly. Rick gave a short laugh. Smaller than the one at the co-op, but still a laugh. "It blocks the sun, sure," Rick said. "But you need warm soil, clean rows, and uniform growth." Harold nodded once. "Bare ground heats fast," he said. "Bare ground dries fast, too." Rick shifted his weight. "You're telling me all this mess is helping corn?" Harold looked at him then. "I'm telling you a field without cover loses water like a bucket left open in the wind," he said. This one doesn't. Rick opened his mouth to answer. Harold spoke again before he could. You're farming the surface, he said. I'm farming what stays under it. That was the end of Harold's part of the conversation. Let me explain the mechanism, because it's the foundation of this story. Residue cover does 3 simple things that mattered enormously in a year, like 1988. First, it shaded the soil surface. That meant less direct heating from the sun and slower evaporation. Second, it reduced the force of wind moving across bare ground. Wind does not only cool things. In drought, it can pull moisture away. Third, less tillage preserved more of the soil structure that allowed water to move downward and remain there. A tilled field often looked cleaner because its surface had been broken apart and smoothed. But under heat and wind, that clean surface could crust, seal, and dry. A residue-covered field looked rougher, messier, even neglected to men who judged with their eyes. But underneath that cover, the temperature could stay lower, and the moisture could last longer. Every farmer in the county understood a hay bale left in the sun dried from the outside first. Every farmer understood a wet towel hung in the wind dried faster than one left folded in the shade. Harold's method worked on the same kind of physical truth. Nothing mystical, nothing fashionable, just protection. The old way did not make rain. It bought time. And in Kansas, in July of 1988, time was worth more than pride. Let me tell you about what happened next, because that's the scene I want you to see. The men along the road heard Harold coming before they saw him. First the sound. Not an engine roaring, not a turbo whining, just the slower, heavier sound of an older tractor working at a deliberate pace. A low diesel knock. A faint rattle from sheet metal that had seen more seasons than some of the men watching. Then the dry hiss of tires moving over crushed stalks. Then the physical sensation. Not a tremor, exactly, more a sense that something substantial was crossing the field with purpose. A machine that did not glide across the ground so much as settle into it. Then the visual reveal. Harold's tractor came over the rise in the field with the old planter behind it, moving row by row through a stand that had been mocked for months. The tractor was no beauty. The paint had faded past its original shade into something between memory and dust. One front weight was scarred. A fender had been straightened long ago and never painted properly after. A small length of baling wire held a light bracket where a proper replacement should have been. The tires were worn but still square on the lugs. The exhaust carried only a thin ribbon of smoke. Behind it, the planter looked older still. Seed boxes scratched, marker arm patched, chains dark with oil and field dust. But every moving part moved with the confidence of something maintained, not merely preserved. "Good Lord," somebody said near the fence. "He's still running that thing?" An older man beside him answered without taking his eyes off the field. "Used to see plenty of them," he said. "Not anymore." Harold never looked toward the road. He never acknowledged the line of pickups, or the men leaning on hoods, or the attention building around him as the drought turned his field from a joke into a question nobody wanted asked out loud. He stopped at the end rows, climbed down, checked the seed trench in one place even though the crop was already there and the gesture no longer mattered for planting, then climbed back on. He moved with the same steady, methodical rhythm he brought to everything. No wasted motion, no performance, no speech. Rick Mullen arrived a few minutes later, parking harder than he needed to, dust kicking up behind his truck. He stepped out, adjusted his cap, and smiled for the crowd. But it was a smaller smile now. "Well," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I guess the trash field made it to July." A few people laughed. Not many. And even those laughs ended quickly. Because from the road, you could already see what no one wanted to admit. The fields, on either side of Harold's, were rolled tighter, lighter, more tired. Harold's field was not untouched by drought. Nothing was. But it was standing differently, holding differently, refusing the heat in a way the clean fields had not. Rick looked again. His smile got smaller. Rick stepped over the ditch and into the first few rows, still smiling, but less certain now. "You really think those old stalks are what did this?" he asked. Harold shut off the tractor and climbed down. For the first time in that whole season, he looked directly at Rick Mullen. His eyes were calm. His face showed nothing. "They bought me time," Harold said. Rick glanced at the rows, then back toward the road, where the others were watching. "That doesn't prove anything," he said. "One field can look better for a dozen reasons." Harold nodded once. "Then dig," he said. Rick frowned. "What?" "Dig in yours," Harold said. "Dig in mine." Rick's face went through several expressions in quick order. Irritation first, then contempt, trying to hold its shape, then something smaller and less comfortable. "This isn't some county test plot," he said. Harold reached into the bed of his pickup, pulled out a narrow shovel, and leaned it against the fence post. "Suit yourself," he said. Then he turned away. That was the line Rick could not answer, because if he refused, in front of that crowd, he was no longer defending science or management or modern practice. He was protecting pride. And every man standing there knew it. Rick took the shovel. No one said anything for a moment. The laughter that had carried Harold's nickname all spring had drained out of the morning, until only the sound of insects and hot wind remained. Rick crossed first into the neighboring field. It had been worked clean in the spring and admired for it. The rows had looked textbook straight in May. In June, they had still seemed respectable. In July, they had begun to look like evidence. He drove the shovel into the row middle with his boot. The blade went in hard. The soil at the top broke pale and tight. Dry crumbs, a thin crust. It took more force than it should have. Rick pushed deeper, lifted, and turned the slice out. Dust fell from it before he fully raised the shovel. A few men from the road stepped closer. Rick crouched and broke the clod apart with his fingers. There was moisture deeper down, but farther down than he wanted it to be. Not gone, but retreating. Pulling away from the roots that needed it most at the worst possible time. Then he walked back across the fence line into Harold's field. The difference began with the sound. The shovel did not strike the surface the same way. It entered through a mat of old stalk pieces and residue with a duller, softer push. Not easy, not loose, but different. Then came the feel of it. The blade went in more steadily. The top did not resist in the same brittle way. Rick lifted the slice. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the soil broke open darker. Not mud, nothing close to mud, but darker, cooler, bound together differently. The underside of the slice held. The moisture had not vanished. It had been protected. Nobody on the road moved. Rick pushed the shovel in again. A few feet farther down the row, same result. 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet. At each stop, the top looked weathered, but the ground beneath the cover held longer than the field beside it. The roots ran into a profile that had not surrendered as quickly. One of the older farmers climbed the fence and came into the row without asking permission. Then another. Then another. Soon 6 or 7 men were crouched in Harold's field, crumbling soil in their hands like they were handling some private embarrassment. They looked at the neighboring field, then back at Harold's. Same county, same sky, same year, different decisions. Rick stood up slowly, the shovel still in his hand. Nobody laughed. Harold had not moved much. He stood near the planter with one hand on the row marker arm, watching with the same calm he had shown all season. He did not smile. He did not enjoy the scene visibly. He did not rescue anyone from it either. One of the younger men finally said what the others were thinking. "I'll be damned." No one answered him. Rick walked farther into the field and split a row with his fingers, checking the base of a plant. The leaves were stressed. Of course they were stressed. This was still 1,988. Heat still ruled the county, but the plant had more left in it. The color held a little deeper. The lower stalk had not given up as early. He looked down the length of the field and saw something he should have seen months before. Harold had not been farming for appearance. He had been farming for endurance. That was the difference. Modern systems had been optimized for good conditions and respectable years. Clean starts, smooth fields, efficient movement, beautiful assumptions. Harold had built for the year when weather stopped cooperating. And the terrible beauty of a drought is that it exposes every assumption a man has made and tests whether any of them were true. Rick crossed back to the road edge and stuck the shovel in the ground. He did not hand it back immediately. He looked at the men near him, but none of them offered him a joke to stand on. They had all laughed, too. The crowd had gone silent together. Harold climbed back onto the tractor. The engine started with that same slow, seasoned certainty. Not loud, not dramatic, just alive. He eased it forward through the rows to check a different corner of the field, as if the whole scene had not centered on him for the last 10 minutes. As if proof itself were only another farm task that needed doing before noon. The planter chains moved. The tractor settled into gear. The residue whispered under the tires. The field kept holding. Rick's smile had disappeared. And no one on that road said the word trash again. Let me tell you about what happened after, because that's the part most people never hear. The drought did not suddenly end because Harold was right. There was no miracle rain waiting neatly at the edge of the story. Kansas stayed hot. The stress stayed real. A lot of fields still disappointed good men who had done the same thing they had been told to do for years. But by harvest, the difference had become impossible to talk around. Let me tell you what happened, because the numbers are the proof, and the proof is why this story exists. On comparable corn ground, Harold's residue-managed field held enough yield to finish near 93 bushels an acre. Not a great year, not a bragging number, but a surviving number. Across the road, on cleaner-worked ground, planted with all the approved confidence money could buy, yields fell to around 61 bushels an acre. 32 bushels. At $2.30, corn, that was a difference of $73.60 an acre. Across even 160 acres, that meant $11,776. On a 320-acre operation, it was the distance between limping through a bad year and being cornered by it. Every farmer in the county had planted corn. Every farmer had watched the sky. Every farmer had prayed for rain. Every farmer except Harold had stripped away part of the protection that field needed when the rain failed. The numbers spread quietly at first, then faster. Men who had mocked Harold's field in April now mentioned it differently in October. They did not call it trash anymore. They called it that Bender field. And in farm country, having a field known by your name for the right reason meant something. A few weeks after harvest, Rick Mullen drove out to Harold's place. He drove slowly. He wasn't in a hurry to get where he was going. The lane was narrow. Cottonwoods moved in the wind along the draw. A dog barked once from behind the machine shed, and then lost interest. The old planter sat inside, with its tongue facing out, cleaned off better than most people would have expected. The tractor was there too, dusted but ready. Rick parked and sat for a moment before getting out. He thought about the co-op. He thought about the laughter. He thought about the shovel entering Harold's field easier than it had entered the field beside it. Harold was near the barn, oiling a chain. Rick told him he wanted to talk about residue managers, row cleaners, and whether older planters could be adjusted to handle more stalk cover without ruining stand placement. Harold listened. He did not hurry the silence. Then he wiped his hands on a rag, set the oil can down, and walked Rick into the shed. He showed him the brackets he had welded. He showed him where he had added weight. He showed him the old bulletin he had kept folded in a drawer. He explained seed depth, opener pressure, and patience in the same flat, precise voice he used for everything else. He did not mention the co-op. He did not mention the nickname. He did not ask for an apology. By then, he did not need one. The field line had said everything. Same county, same drought, same July sun. different choices made in April. And that was enough. Nobody was laughing anymore. This story draws from real agricultural history of the 1988 drought, conservation tillage, and residue-managed farming in the American Midwest. Characters and dialogue are dramatized for storytelling. Did your father or grandfather ever keep doing something everyone said was outdated, only to be proven right later? Tell us in the comments.